It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week, we return to that Museum of the Peculiar for the very first episode of Rod Serling's Night Gallery. Now, previously I did cover the movie-length pilot that featured 3 segments that weren't without some big names attached, like Steven Spielberg, Roddy McDowall, Ossie Davis, Tom Bosley, and Joan Crawford. But the anthology format would remain in place as the series was picked up 13 months later as a regularly running weekly series. Generally speaking, the first season of the weekly show would feature 2 segments, but sometimes there were 3 segments that were fit into the 45 to 50 minute runtime for that week. Interestingly, when we get to season 2, there were, at times, anywhere from 2 to as many as 4 segments per hour. Once the final season, season 3, came along, Night Gallery was cut to a 30-minute time slot, which meant that most of the episodes featured only a single story per episode. And once the show was canceled in May of 1973, there were 2 segments that leaked out that had been made but were not aired during the run of the show. Those got special syndication airings long after the series was formally canceled and long gone. Ultimately, it is safe to say that Night Gallery just didn't quite work out like Serling's seminal Twilight Zone series had. But that said, there are still some interesting things to uncover in this series, and if nothing else, Serling's hosting duties in a dark gallery of macabre paintings is quite memorable and sets the right tone for these stories. But let's get into the first segment of our first regular episode of Night Gallery, The Dead Man. Dr. Miles Talmadge is called to the home of Dr. Max Redford to examine one of Redford's patients, a man named John Michael Fearing. Talmadge at first indicates that John is perfectly normal. He turns to ask Redford what the reason really is for him to be here, and when told to look over John again, Talmadge sees that the patient is now dying from a disease that seems to be slowly deteriorating the young man. When Redford says that he disagrees and that there are, no signs of that disease, Talmadge looks again and John looks completely different and almost like he looks dead and bloated from another disease. Again, Redford disagrees with Talmadge's description of what he might be suffering from, and when he turns around again, John is looking fully healthy and alive, and he gets off the table and introduces himself. All the while, this was all being done by Talmadge looking at John, turning to Dr. Redford tapping something on his desk, and when Talmadge looks back, there's that different condition. So it turns out that John really does think that he has these various conditions. You see, John is extremely psychosomatic. Redford met him when he asked for treatment for a disease. He treated him and sent him on his way. Over the weeks that followed, John kept returning with different diseases. And Redford just kind of saw how John's mind worked and utilized hypnosis to implant every type of condition that the body could get into and placed it right into John's mind. Redford is able to trigger John having different conditions, and the most important one is the last one, which was the complete and total health and looking almost like a perfect human being. Suntanned skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, all of that stuff. And if he's able to transmit that kind of ability to others via this conditioning, all diseases, aging, pretty much everything that can be removed from people, and they could completely and totally defeat health and any other conditions that might prevent them from having these very healthy or normal lives. Now, as it turns out, Redford's wife, Velia, and John are seemingly in an obvious affair. Talmadge offers to give Redford space to work with John away from the home, but Redford says that separating him from his wife will undo all of this work that he's already done. But the next time Talmadge and Redford work with John, Redford displays that John can essentially be killed and given rigor mortis based on various commands and signals that he gives John. Now, seeing this, Talmadge is quite angry that he's kind of playing with this person's life, especially knowing what he knows about John's relationship with Velia, and he demands that Redford undo all of this. However, when Redford gives a command to basically come back to life, nothing happens, and he's not able to change John's condition. By all intents and purposes, John is dead at this point. Velia comes into the lab and sees John dead on the table, and she becomes instantly inconsolable, believing that Redford specifically wanted this to happen and specifically intended to kill John. Now, Talmadge tries to tell Velia that her husband did everything he could once the doctors got there to try to revive John and save him, but in the end, even though he does believe Redford did do the right thing and try to help the kid, John died. And Velia thinks that maybe John's mind is actually still alive in that dead body, and she worries that he might be trapped. She even asks Talmadge if he really truly believes that when they bury John, will they be burying an actual dead person, or will his mind still be working? And Talmadge just thinks there's no way. Everything indicates that not only did his body die, but his mind died as well. Now, after the funeral, Velia is still despondent, and Talmadge goes to pay a visit, and Velia looks quite bad. And she even warns him to not speak to her husband, Redford, and that he has, quote-unquote, the power. Now, Dr. Redford tells Talmadge that, he's going to turn over all of his notes and all of his tapes that he recorded while working with John, and basically let that be his statement on his responsibility for killing John. And he asked Talmadge to study his tapes and those notes. And Talmadge, while listening to these messages and listening to these tapes and hearing the portion where he set John up to be dead and then be brought out of that condition, he notices that the signal that Redford gave to bring John back is not the one that he gave John when he basically killed him. And Velia overhears this conversation between Talmadge and Redford, and Redford doesn't believe that he made a mistake, but Talmadge is like, no, your subconscious changed the command, and therefore you weren't doing the right thing, probably because he did want John out of the way because of his affair with his wife. But anyway, Velia overhears this conversation and runs screaming to John's grave to try to revive him with the correct command. And when she gets there and delivers the proper signal, Talmadge finds that a decomposed John has indeed risen, scaring Velia into a comatose state and having strangled Redford to death. Now, our second story is The Housekeeper, and we learn about a man, Cedric Acton, who's played by Larry Hagman, who wants to hire a housekeeper, but he has some very specific requests. He wants someone who is basically an old hag. He wants someone who cannot possibly get a job with anyone else. So Mrs. Waddle interviews with him, and he asks about family and references, and she has neither. All of her family's passed away, and she has no references to be a housekeeper. And he seemingly suggests that she can be given perfection. And they end up going to a restaurant where Cedric's wife, Carlotta, is dining with a younger man. His wife is basically the exact opposite of Ms. Waddle. Carlotta's beautiful but crippled inside. Ms. Waddle is old and ugly but with an exceptional soul. So Cedric asks Ms. Waddle what she would give to change places with his wife. Essentially, he wants to pull her personality out and place it into Carlotta's body and leave Carlotta's in a broken down body. He sees that as proper penance for how cruel she is to him. Now, when they get back home after this dinner, Cedric has a literal Gothic-style laboratory in the basement of his mansion. After talking about the process and showing the various animals he's tested the transference on, Ms. Waddle really isn't so sure about going forward. However, Cedric explains that she could be young and beautiful and would be rich with over $7 million to her name. Now, he'd not even contest a divorce if she found him to not be a suitable husband. And when Carlotta sees Ms. Waddle, she immediately wants her gone. Cedric says to Ms. Waddle, don't fear. All he wants her to do is sit down in her room and concentrate on a picture of Carlotta until 9 o'clock exactly, when she'll go to the library to meet him, and then they'll start the procedure. And just before 9, we see that Carlotta is giving Cedric the riot act about getting a divorce. And as the clock strikes 9, in walks Ms. Waddle, and the transfer of personality happens. And Cedric then kills Carlotta in the old maid's body. Ms. Waddle, now in Carlotta's body, is pretty unhappy with how this went down. She finally sees Cedric for the monster that he really is. But now, Cedric is getting quite hungry, and he wants to take the Carlotta/Ms. Waddle to their bedroom. And after a night of locking Cedric out of the bedroom, Ms. Waddle decides that the only proper thing to do is to basically leave the man and take the money with her. So Cedric transfers her personality to another old maid who happens to be arriving just as Ms. Waddle is leaving, and says he'll keep doing this until he gets it right. So let's talk about the 3 things that I like about this first episode of Night Gallery. First up, in The Dead Man, there are some really interesting concepts going on here. Well, I mean, I guess that there's another psychological thing going on with the housekeeping, but what's in The Dead Man is a little more scientifically interesting as a science fiction kind of idea. But here you have someone who, through being psychosomatic, is able to basically control his state of health. The idea of mixing hypnosis and mind over matter kind of philosophy that ultimately makes this so that this guy can imitate different conditions and sicknesses. There's a really fantastical premise that almost feels like it's a real concept. It definitely plays maybe with some of the growth of psychology and healthcare that was coming along in the 60s and 70s. It creates a sort of fascinating medical thriller. Then there's a whole lot more going on with the doctor's wife and his patient having a very obvious affair, and how the manipulations of the doctor is affecting both of them, right down to the point that even he isn't so sure that he's consciously doing the right thing, and possibly even subconsciously killing the perfect man that he kind of created, who ended up taking his wife. It's all a fascinatingly twisted web that could really kind of stand for a longer format retelling. It is based on a short story, so maybe that's something that could be dug out someday as and turned into a movie or something like that. That might be interesting. Now, second, also from The Dead Man, the entire performance by Louise Sorrell as Velia Redford is really intriguing. First of all, you're kind of immediately drawn to her because she seems a little too young and vibrant for Dr. Redford. Of course, back then, I guess it probably wasn't all that odd to see a doctor in his 40s or 50s marrying 20 years or more younger than he is. Okay, fine, but she seems much more the age of the patient, who is kind of treated as this kind of young kid who's a bit of a drifter. In addition to that, she's always dressed in these flowing gowns and almost comes off more angelic in nature. Then, when you realize that she's in love with the patient, she almost pays no attention to her husband whatsoever. She almost treats him as an acquaintance, or possibly even like a family member, like a father or an uncle, because she's completely wrapped up in John, who is, again, closer to her age, and their looks kind of more match one another. So she's already acting kind of weird because of this dynamic between her husband and his patient, who is her lover. But then, when John dies, she goes way off kilter. She's not only distraught, but in the weeks after the funeral, she's now basically the Walking Dead herself. Her eyes are darkened and sunken in, her cheeks are thinning, and she looks almost pale and ghoulish. So all that we saw her as in the beginning is now completely decomposed. She barely can even speak or think straight. And by the end of that segment, she's not really any more alive or vibrant than that decomposed body of John. It's just a very interesting character and performance. Thirdly, let's talk about Larry Hagman's basement lab in The Housekeeper. Okay, sure, the Housekeeper story was a lot more lighthearted and a good way to kind of come down from the first segment's heavy thriller and horror elements. Yes, it's funny that he's specifically looking for some old broken down maid down on her luck to hire. Yes, it's funny that he goes out to dinner with her and basically tries to woo her, but not so much romantically, but by trying to appeal to possibly her wanting to be young and beautiful. That doesn't really work on Ms. Waddle. She's a little too pure to be wooed by that concept. It's actually the money that the wife possesses that she would get that actually makes her want to go through with this plan. Still, the moment that actually had me laughing was when Cedric explains to the old lady how all this works. He takes her down to his basement where he has, not even kidding, a Gothic-era lab with beakers of colored chemicals and what have you. It's like he's Dr. Frankenstein on the weekends. But then he also has all these animals that he originally tested on, and you've got dogs making bird noises, birds making cat noises, a pig making rooster noises. It's all farcical, but fitting with the tone of the segment. This is just the center point and the climax, if you will, of a fun 20 minutes of TV with a nice little twist at the end that Cedric is going to keep on trying to get the perfect combination for his perfect mate. In a way, that almost comes down to almost like a Dr. Frankenstein type of story, where he's trying to build something perfect out of a person. Also, real quick, before I close everything down here, I do like that in The Housekeeper, the whole transfer thing hinges upon frogs. Apparently, this voodoo that Cedric do is best done by way of a frog acting as a proper conduit to transfer the personalities to and from people. There is no real explanation for it. It just is. Thank God for that kind of simplistic storytelling and for the tone to help make that all work. All right, so that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. And don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Mastodon and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast on Wednesdays and Monster Mondays on Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, B-Movie Enema, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next week, we have one of the all-time thrillers from roughly the same era, the early 70s, as Vincent Price takes on the title character in an elaborate revenge plot as the abominable Dr. Phibes. Until next week, stay spooky.